From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Beecher Wiggins, and again, I am delighted to be able to introduce the speaker for today's LC's Digital Future and You. We're happy to have with us Dr. Kari Kraus from the University of Maryland. Roberta Schaefer, the Associate Librarian for Library Services, knows of her work and had been involved in some of what she'd been doing and wanted Dr. Kraus to come and talk to us, staff here at the Library of Congress. So we're delighted that we were able to finally arrange and pull this program off. Kari Kraus is an associate professor at the College of Information Studies and the Department of English at the University of Maryland. She's also an affiliated staff member with the Human-Computer Interaction Lab at Maryland. Her research and teaching interests focus on digital humanities, digital preservation, game studies and design, and long-term thinking. She has written for the New York Times and the Huffington Post, and her academic work has appeared in venues such as Digital Humanities Quarterly, the Journal of Visual Culture, the International Journal of Learning and Media, the Cambridge Companion to Textual Scholarship. Her book project, Hopeful Monsters, Computing, Counterfactuals, and the Long Now of Things, is under contract with MIT Press. Today she'll talk to us about a new project being undertaken at the University of Maryland related to extracting data from historic recordings. We're happy to have Dr. Kraus, and I give you Dr. Kraus.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for having me, and a special thanks to Judith and Angela for inviting me. I wanted to start by putting this project in the larger context of my work. This is a very unusual path my research has taken. As stated in the introduction, I work primarily in the areas of digital preservation, game design and research, and long-term thinking. As mentioned, I have a book under contract to MIT Press, and I've presented previously at the Library of Congress on some of my digital preservation work, particularly the Preserving Virtual Worlds project, which some of you might know about. It was funded by the NDIP program at the Library of Congress. And that project was about exploring how to preserve video games. We adopted a case set approach. We had video games from the 1960s through the early 2000s, and we looked at various preservation strategies and methods like emulation, migration, re-implementation, and so forth, and then explored metadata standards and packaging requirements for those games. So I do have a background in digital preservation that the current project intersects with, but it's very different, as I just mentioned, from anything I've ever done before. It's a collaboration with colleagues at the University of Maryland, including Min Woo in the Department of Computer and Electrical Engineering, and Doug Ord in the iSchool. And it's building on pioneering work done by Min Woo, which I'll describe and talk about. The graduate students on the project are Adi Haj Ahmad, also in the ECE program, and Hui Su in the same program. And then I want to give a shout out to our library collaborators at UMD, Chuck Howell, who's head of special collections in mass media and culture, Eric Cartier, a digital reformatting specialist, and Laura Schnitger, ethnomusicologist and sound archivist, also with the mass media and culture special collections. We're quickly finding that we couldn't do this work without them for all kinds of reasons. That slide is cut off just a little bit. The story I'm going to tell is one of the historical entanglement of sound and power transmission or power transmission systems. This Entanglement has a long history, going back to Edison's studio in New Jersey at the turn of the century, before the turn of the 20th century, actually about 25 years before the turn of the century. And so we have actually the first sound device that could both record and reproduce sounds, the cylinder phonograph, invented by Edison, and the first electrical power system, also invented by Edison, occurring roughly in tandem with each other, again around the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So we have these two inventions or technologies happening or occurring at the same place, at the same time, in the same lab, by the same individual. The image you see there is actually from Etsy. I don't know if there's any Etsy fans here, but it's a horn from an antique phonograph that's been retrofitted with light bulbs to turn it into a lamp. So I thought it was a good image that actually embodied that historical connection. Now I want to give a brief overview first of this project. This involves something called ENF, electric network frequency, and I'll be primarily referring to it as ENF in the course of the presentation. These are ubiquitous environmental signals or signatures, or you might call them fingerprints, that get embedded automatically in audio and video recordings at the time they're created. So audio engineers know this as power hum, and they're always trying to get rid of it. It's seen as noise rather than signal. But fortunately, it's almost always still present in a variety of historical recordings, even when an effort is made to filter it out. It's subliminal, of course, and inaudible, but still there. And so we're able to exploit that in really novel and interesting ways. These ENF signatures or traces arise from small pseudo-random fluctuations of the ENF in the alternating current of the power grid. And I'll explain that a little bit more in just a minute. One thing you should know is that we're talking about traces in alternating current, not direct current. And this is going to be a theme that I come back to a little bit later. So the power grid or the power system in the US, the electricity is distributed from power stations to the end users at a value of generally 60 hertz. Now, if it's going to fluctuate or deviate slightly from 60 hertz, and that's what helps us, but that is typical of all North American or almost all North American power grids. The rest of the world is different. The rest of the world, the alternating current is at around 50 hertz. So definitely in Europe and other parts of the world as well. So the US is a little bit different in that respect. This is a map of the power grid system in the United States. And what you see is that this gives you a sense of how much geographical territory any one power system or power grid has control over. So the eastern 2/3 of the US are on a single power grid. The West Coast is on another power grid. And then, of course, the state of Texas has its very own power grid. What this means is that any recording made at the same time as any other recording in the same power grid area or region is going to have identical ENF. They're going to have identical ENF traces. So that's visualized here in this figure, where you have ENF extracted from most likely from a wall outlet in 3 states: Maryland, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. So all on the eastern grid. And so the Maryland, they're closely overlapping, as you see, and that's the point. But the Maryland ENF signature is represented by the red line, the New Jersey by the green line, and the Massachusetts traces by the blue line. These have been normalized somewhat. So a recording made at 8 a.m. in New York City is going to have the same power signature, the same ENF signature, as a recording made at 8 a.m. the same time in, say, Washington, D.C. Here you see power signatures by country, so moving briefly outside of the US. I'm going to be talking almost entirely about the US and really the eastern power grid system throughout this talk, but this is a quick look at the more global landscape. So you see some ENF traces from India's power line, from China's, and then another one from the U.S. And each actually is taken from, the ENF is taken from a different source. So in India, directly from mains power, so most likely from a wall outlet. And then from a photodiode in the US, so a sensor that detects light and converts that light to current or voltage. And then China, the ENF signature is extracted from a video. So each country has its own unique signatures, and Min's actually been doing some research that will allow her, without any reference ENF, to try to geolocate with fairly high levels of accuracy an ENF signature extracted from a recording of unknown origin. So if we don't know where the recording originates, it's not only that we can date and timestamp, but we can start to geolocate it to some extent as well. That's very, very new exploratory research. I tweeted that I was going to give this presentation, and a friend who saw the blurb about it said, "Whoa, that would be a good plot point in a paranoid sci-fi film." And indeed it would. There is a kind of, I think, dystopian dimension to it. But the applications I'm going to be talking about are much more benign. Okay, and so what we see here is, okay, so one thing to know is that the way in which ENF has been used so far has been almost entirely in a few test cases in a legal environment, in a court of law. And of those cases, almost all of them have been in Europe, not the US. And so far scientists they've been working with ENF signatures from recordings for a little over a decade, from say the late 90s, 1999 or thereabouts, forward. And the way in which they've been using it is that they've been extracting or actually creating a database of ENF signals or traces since, depending on the power grid, but since the early 2000s in Europe and a little bit later in the US, around maybe 2004, 2005 in the US. And they've been using a probe. Generally the way it's done is that you insert a small probe into a wall outlet, and the output of that probe is a signal that can be linked up to your computer and then recorded continuously around the clock. So we've got ENF reference databases for some power grids that have recorded the ENF signatures or signals continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year since the late 90s and early 2000s. Now what that allows researchers to do, particularly forensic scientists, is that they can take a recording whose date or timestamp is unknown and try to match the ENF signatures against those in the database. So you're looking for alignments of signatures or alignments of those traces. And it's been used to authenticate recordings. So if you've got a defendant who says that a recording was made at such and such a time, you can, with this technique, verify that it was indeed made at that date and time, or disprove that it was. And you can also detect splicings. Say an audio clip has been inserted between two other audio clips. That will be visible in a spectrogram as a discontinuity in the ENF signature. So what you see in this slide are two spectrograms on the left and in the middle. One is pulled from a video, and the other is pulled directly probably from the power mains. And they occur at the same time, and so they have very similar patterns. When you're looking at a spectrogram like this, and this is, I'm not someone who's well versed in the physics of sound, so this has been a crash course for me, but you're looking for, especially the ENF signatures that we're trying to identify, bands of energy that show up as very strong or bright colors. It's the intensity of the color that signals the strength of the signal. And so you see that in the image on the left and in the middle as that bright red band. And generally you've got, in terms of the X and Y axes, it's often time on the X-axis in seconds or minutes, generally for what we're doing, and then hertz on the y-axis, so the measurement of frequency. And that's sometimes reversed. Sometimes you'll see the hertz frequency on the x-axis and the time on the y-axis. All right, so I mentioned use cases so far have been working with these ENF reference databases. Remember, they only go back to about 1999. So the scientists are working almost entirely with relatively contemporaneous recordings. And we're interested in seeing if we can move the techniques backward in time by as much as, say, 50 years or more, with approaching the problem in different sorts of ways. So if we don't have a time machine that will allow us to go back to the 70s or 80s or earlier to stick a probe into a wall outlet to collect ENF, then what can we do instead? What we're attempting to do, we're actually pursuing two sorts of strategies. One is, and I'll mention it first because it's one that we've kind of put on the back burner from now, but very much still want to explore when we get a chance. That second sort of strategy, again, that we're holding off on for now, involves doing a tremendous amount of research to understand what kinds of archival holdings might exist at power stations and power plants around the U.S. Do they have even if it's data that's been stored on paper or in some other form, there might be useful information in the form of waveforms and so forth that would allow us to have, sort of construct a reference database out of that data. The other technique that we're currently exploring fairly intensely is to create a reference database by drawing on trusted metadata in very large audiovisual collections. So if we've got really good metadata on, say, live broadcasts going back a number of decades, then we can use the ENF signatures in those recordings to help us date recordings of unknown provenance. So a big part of where we are right now is trying to understand the audiovisual universe, if you will. And it's been surprisingly hard to wrap our heads around for a whole host of reasons that I'm sure are familiar to really probably almost everyone here. And that is just the fact that so many of these collections are, they don't speak to one another. There's no federated, sort of finding aids or catalog records for them. So each collection is housed at its own institution. It often doesn't speak in any coherent way to other similar collections within that institution, much less outside the institution. There are often multiple competing finding aids and cataloging records that one must cross-reference and consult. And then there's the metadata quality varies considerably. And so we often get really good metadata on, say, live broadcasts. But for, let's say, films, motion picture films, we don't know when those were created. We know when they were circulated or when they were viewed by the public, but not when they were created necessarily. So this has really opened our eyes, and so we're really exploring a number of, we're taking a kind of really incremental approach right now to try to tease out a number of fundamental and basic research issues to build off of in the future. So one great collection that we are able to draw on right at the University of Maryland, which has an amazing broadcast collection, is the NPR collection. And I know Library of Congress has that too, although my understanding is there's a weird bifurcation where Library of Congress has maybe the cultural programming and NARA has the news and information programming, or switched around. And I think we have at Maryland the news and information as well. The good thing is we have the original media, the original source media. So we're in the process of digitizing that right now, and that's being undertaken by Eric Cartier, who I mentioned at the beginning or the outset of my presentation. But we also, of course, have the original reel-to-reel tapes, and we have playback equipment. And so one thing we're exploring is best practices for preserving or retaining that ENF signature in the digitization process, and I'll say more about that. So we need big audio-visual collections with really good metadata. The NPR collection has great metadata. Right here at the LOC, you've got the National Broadcasting Corporation radio collection, which actually Brian Cornell, who's here in the audience, introduced me to. And that's a tremendous collection on which to draw. And I won't go through all of the statistics right now. I will mention, I guess, the source media, which are those lacquer discs from the 1930s to the 1980s. My understanding is that the data on the lacquer discs was later transferred onto polyester tape and then digitized from the polyester tape, Brian, do you know? Or,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay. And so that presents its own interesting issues, which I'll get to. We're also actively looking for interesting case studies. So I mentioned how we're trying to get reference audio from large audiovisual collections with trusted metadata, but we're also, of course, in search of interesting audiovisual materials that lack good metadata, that might be good candidates for trying to date and timestamp them. And so one just local example right at the University of Maryland is the WMUC radio collection, which has recently been digitized by Laura Schnitger, an audio archivist, and goes back to the 1960s. There's like 1,500 cassettes and reels and discs dating from like 1960 to the late 1990s. And a lot of that has really good metadata, but there are a number of instances where metadata is lacking, and they think they know approximate dates and so forth. So we want to work with some of those, because this is an example of the kind of problem you'd find at other universities around the country, almost all of which have local campus radio stations. But we're also in search of really high-profile examples. And so we immediately started taking a look at the Kennedy White House recordings. There is the wonderful Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. Their presidential recordings program has made available about 5,000 hours worth of presidential recordings covering about 6 administrations from the 1940s to the early 1970s. And that includes the Kennedy tapes. These are all secret recordings. The Kennedy tapes, the Johnson tapes, and the Nixon tapes. And that's about when the secret recordings ended for obvious reasons. So there's this tremendous resource. And a number of the Kennedy recordings, secret recordings of meetings with high-level officials, are undated. And so we immediately zeroed in and honed on some of those. Those exist on 2 different types of source media, reel-to-reel cassette tapes and dictabelts. I don't know how many of you are familiar with dictabelt technology. I wasn't until I started this project. There are approximately 73 dictabelts totaling about 12 hours of conversations, and there's at least 280 separate conversations on those belts. The manufacturing company called these dictabelt records, but as you'll see from the images, they're really in many ways closer. They seem like a sort of closer descendant to the cylinder phonograph. And you've got this sort of plastic film-like substrate that's wrapped around the cylinder, and that's the recording medium. And I have to say, I've been a little bit confused by the technical descriptions I've seen. I'd be curious at the end if anyone is familiar with dictabelt recordings, but the descriptions refer to it as the sound getting recorded as grooves. But I've also seen separate descriptions which implies a kind of intaglio process. But I've seen other descriptions that make it sound like they're embossed and almost in sort of relief. So I did some searches for images, and I couldn't get any close-ups of that film-like plastic stuff to actually see what the sound looks like, although the manufacturing company made a big deal about promoting this technology as visible sound. So we've worked with some with addictive belt records. There are about 8 of them that are undated or that lack timestamps. One we kind of zeroed in on primarily because it's one of the longer Dictabelt recordings, is Dictabelt 5A.1, which records a telephone conversation between Kennedy. This is right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know that much. So we know it's about October 1962 by the content of the audio. So it's Kennedy in conversation on the phone. The Dictabelt recordings are all phone conversations with various high-level officials at a kind of critical moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So when we first started, we thought, awesome, we've got this undated recording. It's really high profile. It could potentially change the way scholars think about this sequence of events. All we need is some reference audio. Well, we'll just get a bunch of reference audio from October 1962, and we'll have nailed this. And no, it didn't work that way at all. We're finding it's so incredibly hard. It's almost like we start to see, and I would just love to see more data on this. You start to get a feel fairly quickly for which decades are really rich in surviving audio and visual materials, and which are more impoverished, and why. And so we started doing a bunch of searches at a lot of collections, including all at the LOC, and it was just maddening. We were finding tons of fragments of sound, but we really were looking for a lot of live broadcasts whose coverage would give us, multiple hours in a day, and we're just turning up empty-handed. So what I did instead with Dictation Belt 5A, which is not there's no, to the best of my knowledge, it has not been dated, but I started doing extensive research to try to really narrow down when I thought it was produced. And there is a lot, by cross-referencing a lot of data, including White House diaries and timelines on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and listening to the tape and looking at logbooks from the White House, I feel pretty certain, pretty darn confident that this was dates from August 31st, 1962 in the evening. And even given telephone records, I strongly suspect at 6:42 p.m. on the Eastern Grid. So then we thought, great, now we can just find audio from the evening of October 31st, 1962. Another dead end. I found out that the CBS Evening News was broadcast at 6:45 p.m. at this time. I believe it was still 15 minutes and it hadn't moved to 30 minutes. This was with Walter Cronkite. So I thought, awesome, there's got to be a copy of the CBS Evening News from October 31st, 1962. No. As far as I can tell, that does not exist. I contacted the archivists, or I guess they're probably records managers, at CBS. They looked for me. Their vaults did not contain this. And they frankly admitted that they've lost a ton of broadcasts from this period. So once again, we came up short. Working with Brian, I have just recently located, which we're in the process of having digitized, a piece of audio from October 31st, 1962 at precisely the right time. So it exists as part of this NBC radio collection on these lacquer discs, and so we will see what information it yields. But as you can see, this has forced us to move back and instead of starting really big, we feel like we really need to explore lower level problems and then kind of scale up from there. So I'm going to talk about some of those, and we're going to go through most of these. The first one is going to be a visual demonstration. One thing we want to do is simply do a visual demonstration of how the technique can work. So can we find multiple recordings of the same event and then align their ENF signatures and as again, a kind of proof of concept? Or can we find recordings of two different things but on the same power grid at the same time? You can imagine multiple recordings of, say, a sports broadcast. So we're starting there. Now, everything has its issues. The first thing we did was we went to the Vanderbilt Television News Archive because they've been recording the nightly news since about 1968, every single evening, at least on the weekdays. So we ordered one copy of the CBS Evening News from August 9th, 1974, and one copy of the NBC Evening News, which were both broadcast at the same time in 1974 on the same grid. The recordings originate from the same grid. Anybody know the significance of that date, by the way? Yeah. That's right. Yeah, the Richard Nixon resignation. And so, but then what we saw is you can see the E and F signatures. Those are going to appear way down. You see the Hertz measurements on the y-axis. And so remember that our power grid system the electricity is this alternating current at 60 hertz. So you see the E and F signature at the 60 hertz line. It's much brighter and more visible in the NBC image on the right than on the left. And then you also see it, we often can work at other harmonics, at higher harmonics. So if we don't get good E and F signatures at the 60 hertz level, we can move up to different harmonics often. And so you see the E and F traces at 120 hertz, 180 hertz, 240 hertz as well. But they don't align well between the two broadcasts. And here's why. If we had thought about this from the beginning, we would have been able to anticipate this problem, which is that these news broadcasts are live really in name only. You do have the anchor presenting live, but that's intercut with all kinds of pre-recorded segments or live segments from other power grids or locations from our perspective, and then interrupted by commercials. So you see here an approximate timeline showing the news show breakdown by clip type. And you can see that the live segments are very, very few. Those are in red. So you've got the CBS broadcast on the left and NBC on the right. And the live elements are very few. Some are like 10 seconds in a 30-minute broadcast or 23 seconds. And then those live segments almost never match. They do in a few instances. So we could, with some effort, find segments to align, but we decided that we would move on. We had better luck with two concurrent Apollo 11 audio recordings. So one of these was taken from the intercom loop used by the flight director in the mission control room to direct others involved with the Apollo 11 landing. And then so that's one recording. That's the recording that you see in red, the E&F signature in red. And then the other one is taken from it was a recording that was sent out or broadcast to the public by a public affairs officer in Houston. So you could hear the astronauts' voices on both recordings, and we knew that these were at the same time, and we did an alignment of the two E and F signatures from those recordings. And so they align really well. Where you do see deviations is generally because some semantic content in a recording ends up being at the same Hertz value as the E and F signature itself. So that creates some misalignments. But they align very well. So we're continuing doing some of that. So we're able to demonstrate that if we do have two recordings produced on the same power grid at the same time, that we can indeed align their signatures. Now, another interesting problem is differentiating different E and F signatures in the same recording. And so as audiovisual specialists, you know that very often the case, the recordings we have are copies of copies of copies. So it's the case that the content or the data has been migrated or transferred from one physical carrier to another, and then at some point maybe digitized. And so that creates multiple ENF signatures in the recordings. So we need techniques to differentiate them, and then we also need techniques to boost and enhance those signatures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This is a nice example. In this case, we have a spectrogram of a Kennedy recording, not one of the Dictabelt recordings, but one of the audio cassette recordings. And you clearly see two ENF signatures. One is brighter or more intense than the other, the one on the left. And then we see that one of the signatures actually extends over a longer period of time than the other one. In this case, we've got time on the y-axis and then hertz on the frequency measurement on the x-axis. So what happened in this case, the first problem is, how do you know which is the original ENF signature, and how do you know which one is the recaptured ENF signature as part of the digitization process? How do you know which is which? And in this case, we see that one signature runs for a longer period of time than the other. And so we were able to tell by listening to the recording that the original recording stops at one point. There's just silence, while the digitization recording keeps on. And so we were able to determine that the signature on the left is from the original audio recording, and the signature on the right is from the digitization process. Interestingly, in almost every case, in fact, I don't know that there's any exceptions at all. The original ENF signature from the analog media tends to be stronger and more robust than the digitized signature. And one problem that we run into is that often when there's more than one signature, they overlap completely, as in the image on the right. So we know that there are actually two signatures there, but one is covering or overlapping the other. So what do you do? So we've developed some techniques for handling situations like this. One is there's just techniques that allow you to subtract away one of the signatures, but I'm going to talk about some other ways too. This is a March on Washington recording from 1963. It's a Voice of America broadcast recording from 1963. And what you see is one really good ENF signature at the 63 hertz mark or thereabouts, that really bright signature or band. But there are two other faint signatures. So we've actually got three ENF signatures showing up in this one recording. One is very faint at the 60 hertz level. And then the other is pretty darn faint at also around 63 or 64 hertz. So what we did in this case is what you'll notice is that the 63 hertz that's not normally where you'd expect to see an ENF band, an ENF frequency band, because remember our power grid is 60 hertz, not 63. We intentionally recalibrated the playback equipment so that where there was some speed deviation, either we've done both higher and lower, as a way to prevent the overlap of ENF signatures from the original recording and then the one in the digitization process, just slightly deviating the speed. So you get one at this higher hertz mark. And then we simultaneously we are collecting when we do when we're experimenting with when we do the digitization process, we're simultaneously collecting reference ENF from a wall outlet, so that it makes it so that we can take that reference ENF from the wall outlet that reflects the same time as the ENF we're going to get from the digitization process, and that allows us to easily distinguish the digitization ENF from the ENF in the original recording. So two techniques there. One is the speed deviation, and one is collecting at the same time as digitization the reference ENF. Now that third ENF signature, we speculate, is that the Voice of America recording was itself at least a second generation recording, that it had been copied off of some other physical carrier. And so you're getting the remnants of that. So, and this is actually just the same recording at different harmonic levels. So at the 126 harmonic level. So we are going to conduct what I call the Alvin Lucier I am sitting in a room experiment. If any of you are familiar with the sound artist Alvin Lucier, this is a famous piece of his where he records this, he speaks a very short piece of text. It takes like a minute to recite. And it's self-referentially describing him sitting in a room and recording the sound of his own voice. So he records the sound in a room with good resonance, and then he plays that recording back into the same room and re-records it, and then takes that recording, plays it into the room, and records that. So you get this sort of transmission chain effect. In some ways it's like the children's game of telephone or Chinese whispers, where you have multiple generations of copies. And we took the Alvin Lucier, one of the recordings, to see if we could get a bunch of, I don't even know how many repetitions there are in this recording, at least 15, I would say. But the problem, we did get some okay results. The problem is each recording in and of itself is so brief that it doesn't provide very good data. We generally like around 10 minutes of recording to work with, although we have methods for dealing with shorter recordings. But we want to do some lab experiments where we create a recording in some kind of acoustic chamber, make a recording, and then play it back in the Alvin Lucier style. Record that, play that version back, record that, and see how many ENF traces we can get, given that we know we'll encounter real-world examples, as you just saw, where there are more than 2 ENF traces. We're also just experimenting we're trying to understand the quality of the ENF and the distortion problems we see with ENF on a wide variety of physical carriers or media types. So we just want to see what we can extract ENF from. And so far we've experimented with compact cassette tapes, with reel-to-reel audio tapes, with dictabelt recordings, and we're about to find out about the lacquer discs. And so so far in every case, we've gotten good ENF signatures on these different analog media formats. And we want to just experiment with as many as we can. So I just listed a few examples here from wire recordings, from motion picture optical sound, from electric phonographs. So the earliest phonographs would have been purely mechanical in their processes, but electric models came out pretty early. And so as a kind of limit case, can we get any ENF from that? And I'll say something about that in just a second. Also, we were interested in what ENF can do, not just in terms of date and time stamping recordings, but what it can tell us about the technology more generally, or the composition techniques of artists. So I just chose optical sound, which is one I would love to experiment with, which is these pictures of waveforms that are actually printed on film stock. And this was used in the 1930s and 40s. And you see actually on the right hand the waveforms as a representation of waveforms on the film stock. The most famous example is probably Disney's Fantasia, which used this optical sound technique, optical soundtrack technique. And it has that, and if you've seen the movie, there's that interesting intermission episode where the conductor of the orchestra speaks to the audience and gives them this mini lesson in how optical sound works. And so there's an animation of the soundtrack. And he says very sort of poetically, every beautiful sound also creates an equally beautiful picture. So it's this very self-referential moment where he's talking about the soundtrack underlying the film and the techniques. So, what's interesting about this technique is that editors who used it could visually edit the film. They wouldn't have to listen to it. They would play with the visual patterns printed on the film stock and could splice and so forth. And so we'll get different ENF signatures for the different audio segments. And I think there's, one potential of this technology is what can we learn about different techniques by extracting a lot of these embedded signatures. We also want to explore whether there are any traces that come from recordings that were made on grids with direct current. This goes back, I said one thing we're interested in is a limit case. How far back in time can we go to extract meaningful signatures? And in the early history of power transmission, there was the so-called battle of the currents between direct current and alternating current, with alternating the currents actually changing directions, and the direct current, it's just going one way. And so Edison, who invented the first power transmission system, used direct current. He had a little system, he called it his electrical light system, in the Menlo Park Laboratory, and then also on Pearl Street in New York City in the late 19th century. And that used direct current. One problem with direct current is that the generator or the power plant has to be located very close to the facilities that it's powering. And one advantage of alternating current is that you can have much longer transmission lines connecting the power plant to the end user. So we had this battle of the currents, and Edison fought very hard for all kinds of reasons, for ego reasons, for monetary reasons, for direct current. And there was, if some of you might know the tale of Topsy the elephant, who was a victim of this whole battle of the currents. This was a circus elephant who gained notoriety for killing one of his trainers. And it turns out that the trainer was actually like burning cigar butts into the elephant's trunk, which is just horrible. And so no wonder the elephant acted out, but it was decided that he needed to be put down. And so Edison volunteered to, this is a macabre story, but electrocute the elephant. And he filmed the entire thing using early motion picture technology, also developed by Edison, and then used that as in part of his campaign for advocating for direct current, because he used alternating current to electrocute the elephant. Alternating current had been legal as an execution method for humans for about 3 years at this time. And so he wanted to associate in the public's mind the danger of alternating current as a way to encourage the use of direct current. But it didn't pan out, and we all use alternating currents now. But still, direct current grids persisted in places up until like the 1960s. And we're actually seeing a new rise of DC current because so many of our electrical devices, all of our electrical devices, our iPhones, our PCs, our flat screen TVs, et cetera, use direct current. So we have a little converter that's, that we have to use that converts the alternating current from our power mains to direct current. Right now, that accounts for up to 1/5 of our total power consumption, but there have been predictions. I'm actually citing a piece by Peter Fairley in the MIT Technology Review, that within about 20 years, up to 50% of our power consumption will be using direct current. So there's an emergent rise of DC microgrids consequently. So we think that by exploring the limit case of direct current with very early audio recordings, it also speaks to audio forensic scientists working with more contemporary recordings, because they'll also have a need to work potentially with recordings that have traces. We wouldn't call them E and F traces. There's some other kind of trace potentially from direct current. And then finally, I'll conclude with something that we are proposing in a new grant proposal, which is a public time coding service. So one thing we know is that a ton of audio and video with audio exists out there not only at institutions, at collecting institutions, but also private individuals. And so if we could crowdsource audiovisual, that would help address a lot of the problems I've mentioned in the course of this presentation. And it could form the backbone for a system where an end user theoretically could upload a piece of audio or video, and sometimes even video without audio. We've been able to actually detect ENF in videos without audio when there's indoor lighting. The fluctuations in the indoor lighting also allow us to extract ENF. So if we could crowdsource trusted metadata and audio recordings, and then also use that as a service to the public and to collecting institutions, where they could upload a file and see if there's any match in the database, an ENF match in the database that would then give you back several pieces of information, whether there is a match, the time at which the recording then was made, the approximate location, the source of the reference ENF trace, and the duration of any continuities, any discontinuities. I was reading through recently the State of Recorded Sound Preservation in the United States, that white paper commissioned by the Library of Congress and published by CLEAR, the Council of Library and Information Resources. And they note the need, they advocate for the need for a national recorded sound database, quote, create a unified database of sound recordings held by libraries and archives as well as by individual collectors to address problems of discovery. So could something like the public time coding service also be the basis, a kind of foundation for such a national sort of census of sound? And I'll just say one problem that we have too that we're addressing is the storage capacity of different analog media formats. So I said that we like to work with at least 10 minutes of recording time, but a lot of early media formats contain less data than that. So we're developing techniques to work with shorter segments of ENF. And then a lot of barriers, as I've covered throughout this presentation. One of them is copyright, as you can imagine. And we're very eager to work with the NBC radio collection, but we know too that'll entail getting copyright permissions from NBC itself. I mean, I'll point out the irony that we're entirely indifferent to the semantic content. We couldn't be less interested. The semantic content to us is noise, and the noise to us is signal. And so we're trying to extract the stuff that audio engineers are always trying to get rid of. And so if ever there was a case for fair use here, I would like to think that this could be it. Can you help us? We're looking for interesting case scenarios, interesting recordings to work with. We're looking for funding sources. We're looking just for help maybe building the public time coding service. And so I will leave you with a couple of relevant publications. I actually accidentally duplicated 2 of the publications, but we have our first short article is coming out as a team as part of the I-Conference proceedings later this, in March 2014. And then a recent piece by Min and her students. The lead author is actually Hui Su, one of our graduate students, looks at some of the recapturing problems that we've been trying to address. And so thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. Hi. Yeah, in the back?
The database that you mentioned that currently exists.
Yeah.
Who maintains it?
No one does right now. So this is we're actually writing an NSF proposal right now, and so we're proposing this as one potential component of the project.
So the recordings that you said that exist from like the late 1990s.
Right. Oh, that database. Got it. Not the public service. Yeah. Okay. So this is a really great question. I want to. So initially, with the first one was developed on the Romanian power grid in Europe by a scholar named Caitlin Gregorius, and for a long time, this scholar was the keeper of the ENF database. It was not an institutional, really, at least that's not my understanding. Now I want to say in Europe, the FBI or the police department in England maintains a database. In the US, it seems to be, these databases seem to be associated with universities. I believe Virginia Tech is the keeper or the custodian of one such database, presumably for the Eastern Grid in the US. I'm not even sure that there is a database for the Texas grid yet. As of around 2011, there was not a database for the Texas grid to the best of my knowledge, but it's not hard to do. I mean, with the storage capacity, you just need one of these probes, and the storage capacity makes it relatively viable to do this. And theoretically, you just need one database for each grid, although obviously redundancy is a good idea. So if we've got, if we've got individuals at different institutions keeping their own databases, that would be really useful. In Maryland, we don't have our own reference database, but we periodically, as I mentioned, gather ENF. So when we're digitizing recordings, we'll gather ENF as a reference. But yeah, and we're just, I mean, in terms of, I have very little sense of other parts of the globe, what's being done. I did show some of those, some of the spectrograms from India and China, but I don't know if there are extensive databases. It would be, if the LOC would like to do that, that would be awesome.
Besides the sort of unique time matching of fluctuations, is there anything more general that you can learn about patterns of fluctuations from different time periods? You know, for example, maybe in the 1960s, because they did a certain kind of testing at a certain time every day, there would be a signature fluctuation, but that testing was stopped, so we would know that anything that had that kind of fluctuation would be from a certain era. Or maybe the fluctuations had become less pronounced because they figured out a way to control for them in a way that they didn't, and you can timestamp from a before and after.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think we don't know enough yet. I mean, if we're using, there's a way in which you can use the recordings to kind of reverse engineer the power grid, right? And you can actually learn a lot about the power grid technology through the intermediate technology of the recordings. It may be that when we start to explore the power grid archives that will emerge. Now, I do know that my colleague Min Wu, she is working on methods, and I mentioned this very, very briefly, that will allow her to take a recording of unknown origin and basically approximate which grid across different parts of the globe it belongs to. I think there's probably that potential, and I think that's a really, really interesting idea, because it would allow you to at least narrow down some period of time, even if you couldn't get precision of a precise timestamp or even a precise day. If you could say this is definitely between 1922 and 1924, right? That's still interesting, right? Depending on the situation. So I think that's a really good idea. I think we have to learn more. Yeah. Or yeah.
If you knew the date but not the time
Mm-hmm.
recording, and you have and there's a definitive matrix number in an engineer's log, and you have a recording from that matrix, does that begin to give you the
Yes.
information you need?
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways you can start to narrow things down. So sometimes we do have, I mean, even just the spreadsheet I've been working with or looking at quite a bit of the radio collection at the University of Maryland. Often they have approximate dates for things, and so if you've got an approximate date, you can begin to assemble reference recordings around that time period to help you better. Or if you just know the day, then you need a much smaller amount of audio to then give it a precise timestamp. So there are ways to start narrowing things down, but I think your question really speaks to that, and I think we just have to advance a lot more in the research, but I think that seems like a really fascinating area to explore. Brian.
Yeah, I was wondering, I mean, audio engineers use power conditioners to try and get the rhythm.
Yes.
Is there some way that on such recordings it would leave a trace anyway that you could figure out?
Well, so we've been wondering about this. with the Voice of America recording of the March on Washington, their digitization it's all about getting, a very clean recording. And so I think that's one reason you're getting a weaker ENF signature. But I'm not entirely sure you're ever eliminating that ENF signature. It seems we found that with lossy file formats, even with MP3, we can often extract ENF, and it doesn't even have to be that the recording equipment was plugged into a wall outlet necessarily. That's when you get the best ENF. But if the recording equipment is operating on batteries, but it's in an indoor environment as part of there's an electromagnetic field, there's going to be coupling between that electromagnetic field and the recorder and the microphones. So you're still liable, even in a condition like that, to get ENF. So that would be, I think, another interesting lab experiment to do, is to take a recording, and this would be, if anybody has such a recording, we would love to work with it, where the audio engineer, tried to block all power hum, right? Is there anything that's still there? I would love to do a test on that. Yeah.
A suggestion for that. You mentioned the Apollo 11 recordings.
Yes.
Did you use both the Capcom communications and the recordings that were done in the capsule?
So
They're different.
they're different, right? This is where I wish I had my colleague Doug Ord with me, because he's doing another NSF project on the Apollo 11 recording. So I know very little about them. I do know there's at least 3 sources of audio that they're trying to synchronize. So that's one actually application domain for this, is if you've got a complex set of events unfolding in time and you want to create a really tight timeline synchronizing the evidence around that event, you can imagine taking multiple recordings unfolding over a period of hours and aligning them by finding their overlapping segments and doing really complex alignments. And so that's some of what we were doing with the Apollo 11 recordings, with those alignments. But yeah, that's a really good question. I know there are at least 3 sources of audio from the landing itself. So, yeah.
You mentioned the courts in Europe using ENF data. How relevant do you think that could become as evidence in a court of law?
Well, it already has been used in a number of cases. I want to say if you Google for, and this is why I mentioned like the police department or the FBI in England is keeping one of the ENF reference databases. There was a BBC story a year or two or a few years ago on how ENF was being used in legal contexts. So a lot of it has to do with standards of evidence. So the forensic community works with very high standards of evidence that will make this admissible within a court of law. And there's one, for example, master's thesis from I think 2011 that actually goes into great detail about the configuration of the ENF database that's needed to make this kind of evidence admissible in a court of law. So with our work, we're not meeting that threshold of evidence. We're still working with very high probabilities. And when we take 2 recordings and can align their signatures, the idea that they would be a random match, the idea that there would be a false match is very, very low. So we're still working with very high probabilities, but we're not at that same threshold of forensic evidence that you are seeing with scientists working with the really contemporary recordings. And in fact, they often they don't like working with analog media at all. They don't see it as sufficiently the signatures as sufficiently trustworthy, I guess. But part of our research program is developing new techniques to address a variety of the problems we encounter with the analog media.
I'm not sure if this has any relation, but you talk about the power grid and all. I've heard, I don't know whether this is commonly done anymore because it's probably dangerous, but I remember a teacher years ago said that for receiving a signal, one of the best antennas, if you can isolate it, is to plug into just one of the two plugs of a house, and you have like the whole state of Maryland being your antenna. But of course, I suppose if you make a mistake, there's some danger of electrocution, fire, whatever. Is there any relation between that and have you ever heard of this kind of?
No, I haven't. And all I really know is there are, in a number of studies, just as there is research on configuring the databases, the ENF databases, according to standards that will be admissible in a court of law, so too there are schematic designs for the probes, the ENF probes, to insert into wall outlets. So, but beyond that, I know very little about the data collection from a direct power main source. Other than you want that. I mean, that's the best kind of ENF reference to work with. Yeah.
So for the people that are doing digitization now,
Mm-hmm.
they are collaborating.
Great question. Yes.
Do we need to do something different, or can you get what you need from our data set?
This is something we want to do a paper on this, and we want to think about. Some practices are already helpful. So at University of Maryland, for example, Eric Cartier, his preservation master for the NPR recordings retains the tones and silences in the original recording, and then the various derivatives get rid of that and the access copies. But that is very, very helpful. In fact, we get stronger ENF in those when there's no content extract, to interfere with the ENF signal. So that's already in play. Now, is it one thing is that audiovisual archivists or digitization experts are already creating multiple files as part of the digitization process. I mean, there's I forget all the terminology, but the preservation master, the access copies, the production. I think there's what's the term I'm thinking of? Service copy. Could we have an ENF trace copy? It's always about resources, right? That's the problem. And ideally, you have. I mean, I'm going to sketch out the utopian vision. The utopian vision is that you've actually got two playback devices. So one for your preservation master that you're going to get all your derivative copies from, and then one for your ENF trace copy where you're actually using that speed deviation technique. So you actually are re-instrumenting or recalibrating that playback device differently from the other one. But you could still hypothetically have a ENF trace copy that is produced from the same playback equipment as the other copies. You wouldn't have that offset effect that would be really useful, but nonetheless, it would still be. I think there could be other techniques. So the other thing you can do actually is, this is something I've mentioned, is if audiovisual archivists had a probe and they were collecting ENF as they were digitizing, and they had a database of that, right? Then you've got ENF reference that allows people who work with ENF to say, okay, this is the digitization ENF, and I know that because there's also reference audio. Maybe the metadata for both is sort of packaged together, and then you can instantly say, I can disregard that if you're interested in the original ENF signature from the analog media. So I really want to do a paper where we're exploring that issue. What might this mean for audiovisual practice, and particularly digitization, but also media. I mean, reformatting isn't just from analog to digital. It's often also from analog carrier to analog carrier, as we see with the NBC collection, which went from the lacquer discs onto polyester tape. So there's implications for that as well.
I have a basic question. I think I heard you say that you could also pin down where the recordings took place, but that's only within the grid, right? You couldn't go to a state or a
This is right. Right. So you can sort of think of the time capabilities that ENF gives us are of much finer granularity than the geolocation abilities, which is really just about narrowing it to a grid. And as we saw, a single grid covers a lot of territory. That's useful for the date and time stamping. That's the larger the grid, the better for the date and time stamping, because then you've got just your universe of reference audio is much larger. But for the geolocation side of things, it works against you. But that's also a research area.
is there likely that there's something in
There may very well be. Min has suggested as much, so there may very well be.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.